Okay, so I know I'm not the most prolific YouTuber out there, but it has literally been a year since the first episode of this podcast. And even I know that that's a bit too much. That's pushing it a bit. The idea was that I would talk about the novels in the Monogatari series that haven't been adapted yet, but now they've just announced the adaptation of Off-Season and Monster Season, so who knows, maybe the anime will be out before episode 3 of this podcast. And what makes it even worse is that I said I was making these podcasts and reading through these novels because I was working on this big Monogatari video, and I am still working on it now. And I had already been working on it for a while, I think like a couple of years at least, before making that first podcast. So, yeah. But I am actively working on it. Progress is being made. I have no idea when it's going to be out, but it will come out eventually. I promise, I swear. But anyway, today we're going to be talking about Suruga Bonehead, which is the second arc of the first book of Off-Season. And as you can probably guess, this is a Suruga POV. Her second, I think, after Hana Monogatari. And this story is what we call a rikro in the business, a bottle episode, if you will. It's set entirely within Suruga's bedroom, her messy bedroom, and it starts off with her trying to clean up the room with the aid of Ogi, who is now a he, and they end up stumbling upon a hidden letter, a sort of cipher, this weird coded poem type thing, that was enclosed within a fusuma, which is one of those traditional Japanese sliding doors. And the whole story is basically just one really long conversation between Suruga and Ogi as they attempt to decipher this message that we eventually find out was written by Suruga's mother and intended for her husband, Suruga's father. And obviously this is something that Nishio Shin is particularly good at, writing these kinds of dialogue-driven stories with limited plot developments. And actually whenever I think about these kinds of bottle episode type things, I'm always reminded of this line from one of the, and this is a pretty out there reference, but one of the audio commentaries for Rick and Morty. Yeah. I used to really enjoy listening to the Rick and Morty DVD commentaries with Dan Harmon and the other writers and whatnot. And it is actually, they are actually pretty good. If you're interested in writing and script writing for television or whatever, the way they break down the stories and everything is definitely worthwhile. It's worth listening to if you're interested in script writing. But there's one episode, I think it's a season 2 episode. There's a B-plot where Jerry and Beth go down into Rick's secret base underneath the garage, and there's an alien locked up there. And the whole B-plot is just them arguing in that room about Rick and stuff, and basically nothing happens. And Dan Harmon in the audio commentary, he's really down on this plot line because he talks about the hubris of trying to write this story where nothing happens, where it's just two people arguing. I guess I can just play the clip, but basically the idea that it's sort of arrogant, to try and write that kind of story, which is funny really, because Community has loads of great bottle episodes, but I guess the difference here is that it really is just two people talking and nothing happens.
But this is one of our biggest failures in history as a human species.
This bee story?
Yeah.
What did you call it 2 days ago? A series of stall beats?
Yeah.
I thought that was
That's
especially harsh.
a museum.
Double beat, triple beat.
A museum of stall beat exhibits.
There's the dad. There's Rick's dad. The glasses.
The shame that I feel is because I feel my hubris stench coming off of that B story, because someone must have said, "No, trust me. If they go down there, just give me a fucking pen and paper. And good night, nurse." It just feels like I thought you could tell a story standing in front of an alien.
But if there is one person who can write a storyline like that, it is Nishio Shin. He's one of the few writers whose work is arguably at its best when it's just two characters talking. I've always been curious how Nishio Ishin composes his stories, like how he actually goes about it, because the way the dialogue flows, it does seem kind of meandering and like aimless, doesn't it? But it always sort of wraps back around and feels relevant to the themes of the story, and obviously all of the dialogues reveal the characters in some way, but it feels kind of improvised. So I do wonder if he just goes into these stories having sort of a vague outline of where he wants to go, like a vague direction in mind, and then he just kind of vomits out the dialogue, or if it's more actually more composed and deliberate than we might expect. But this story is basically a mystery story, right? We have these two characters, and Ogi, of course, is always playing the detective, and they're just trying to decipher this message. And this isn't surprising, really, is it? Because Nishio Ishin is coming out of that tradition of mystery fiction. I mean, every Monogatari arc is a mystery story to some extent, and we have actually had a sort of bottle episode mystery before with Ogi, actually. Which one was that? That was Ogi Formula, I think. The one where they're trapped in that classroom, Araragi and Ogi. So this is along those lines. But yeah, it feels like Nishio Ishin, that is, has set himself the challenge of writing a mystery story with the fewest amount of elements as possible. Just this one room, these two characters, Ogi's kind of weird, maybe 1.5 characters, and this one item, this letter to decode. And it's funny because when we look at the Monogatari series, we see all of the references to sort of otaku media tropes and archetypes that we're familiar with from anime and manga, but it's just as much infused with the tropes and archetypes and conventions of detective fiction. And this is because in the 80s and 90s, I think, there was a bit of a resurgence in detective fiction in Japan. A bunch of writers who, I think they're referred to as the neo-orthodox school, because they were more of a return to the original form of, say, like Edgar Allan Poe stories from the early 20th century, which, took the sort of Agatha Christie, obviously Edgar Allan Poe style of murder mysteries, and imported that into Japan. But that particular approach to detective fiction was then challenged in the 50s and 60s, I think, with the kind of social realist school of detective fiction, which was more about social, political critique, and I think was attempting to be a bit more literary. But then you have all of these mystery fiction nerds that emerge in the 80s and 90s that go against that, and that want more of a return to those strict conventions of mystery writing, of detective fiction. That kind of precise, almost mathematical writing where you set up the mystery, set up all the clues, the possible suspects, the red herrings, and the way the story is resolved is a sort of rationalistic, logical deduction. And obviously Nishio Ishin is kind of coming out of that tradition, and so he loves to have all of these. I mean, he's written outright detective fiction stories before, obviously the Zaragoto series, and that other series that I think is still ongoing. I forget what it's called. It's the one with the girl who has like amnesia, and she forgets everything every day, and so she has to solve every case within like 24 hours or whatever. The Monogatari series isn't as much of an outright detective fiction kind of story, but it does have a bunch of references to detective fiction in it. And then obviously you have the Ogi character who presents himself as a kind of detective. But yeah, I wanted to comment that what's interesting about that, with how the orthodox detective fiction stories are usually written with that kind of precision, how that contrasts with what we associate with Nishio Ishin's sort of writing style, of that kind of free-form dialogue that just flows and feels kind of improvised. There's an interesting contrast there of the free-form style of the dialogue with the precision and focused nature of detective fiction. And somehow Nishio Ishin manages to make that work. But yeah, that connection, that fusion of what I'm, I guess, referring to as otaku media tropes and detective fiction, that's actually something that the theorist Hiroki Azuma talks about in, I think it's in Database Animals. He talks about the moe of detective fiction. So for him, moe is basically that feeling that we feel towards the kind of the database, or the recognition of all these different tropes and conventions that we classify and categorize, to the point where, you know, when we're watching anime, reading manga, consuming these kinds of media, we're constantly identifying and fixating on and obsessing over specific tropes, kinds of characters, you know, your tsunderes or whatever, all the things you recognize from this media. It provokes that sort of, you know, maybe slightly autistic feeling of affection, and that's what moe is. And so Azuma talks about that neo-orthodox school that I described in those terms, where these writers are creating a more self-aware kind of moe detective fiction, where the implicit tropes and conventions of the genre sort of rise to the surface and become part of the meta text. And those stories often comment on the tropes and conventions. And obviously, you know, talking about meta writing, this is something that Nishio does very well. But going back to Ogi's character, there's another aspect of this character that's interesting when put into the context of detective fiction, which is the fact that obviously Ogi is a bit of a kind of black hole that just emerges out of nowhere in when does she first appear? It's in second season, right? I think it's at the beginning of Mayui Jiangshi, the time travel arc. Obviously, by the end of Owari, we know what exactly and what exactly Ogi is. This sort of manifestation of Araragi's sense of self-criticism as a kind of subconscious manifestation, right? So to me, I always associate Ogi's character with a kind of psychoanalytical voice in the story because of that association with the subconscious and because of what she represents. And Ogi's kind of a therapist in a way, right? Like she asks these sort of leading questions and just points you in a particular direction so that you can figure, I say you, I mean first Araragi and now Suruga, so that they can figure something out about themselves, about their subconscious, their past or whatever. But the other association with psychoanalysis that's kind of interesting is that when Ogi is a manifestation of Araragi's subconscious, she's a she takes on a female form. But when he's with Suruga, he's now a male form. And that reminds me of, if I'm remembering my Jungian psychology well enough, I believe that tracks onto his ideas of the anima and the animus, which are these sort of representations of the opposite sex that we have within us. So men will have this image of the feminine within them, and that's the anima, and women will have a representation or projection of the masculine within them, and that's the animus. And I think it's usually based off some kind of identification with the parent. The mother is the feminine, the father is the masculine, obviously. I believe that's right. I might be getting that wrong. But the other connection that's even more interesting to me between psychoanalysis and detective fiction is this famous, well, relatively famous Lacan essay. There's Jacques Lacan essay about Poe's, one of Poe's original Dupin detective stories, The Purloined Letter. It's a really interesting essay. I suggest you go read it. And The Purloined Letter and another Poe story, The Gold Bug, are actually mentioned explicitly in this story, in Suruga Bonehead, by Ogi, of course, because he's a big detective fiction fan. I don't know if Nishio ever read that Lacan essay. That's a sort of psychoanalytical analysis of Poe's detective fiction. Although it wouldn't be that surprising, because I think Lacan was big, or was sort of imported into Japanese culture in the 80s, and that was part of the foundation, I think, of Anno's interest in psychoanalysis in Evangelion. That's the kind of cultural milieu that Anno was coming out of as well. So, I mean, it's possible that Nishio has read that essay, I guess, especially, considering his interest in detective fiction. So yeah, to me, Ogi is an interesting character because of that, because he has that position as at the sort of intersection of detective fiction and the psychoanalytic aspect of the story, which is, by the way, whether or not it's intentional, the psychoanalytic aspect of the story does run pretty deep. I mean, it's all over the place. Obviously, one of the major aspects of psychoanalysis is the relationship with the parents, right? And, I mean, if you've read or watched Monogatari, you can see that runs throughout the whole thing. The previous episode that we just did, Sodachi Fiasco, obviously is on some level about her relationship with, in that story, particularly her absent father, and we had dealt with her relationship with her deceased mother in her previous arcs in Owari. And now, again, in this arc, Suruga's relationship with her mother, obviously, is central to the story. But, I mean, all throughout the whole series, I've been rereading Bake recently. Well, not rereading, actually, reading it for the first time. And it's just made me realise that if you were just going off those first few stories in Bake, Hitagi Crab, Mayoi Snail, all that, you wouldn't be mistaken to think that this series was going to be all about these characters' relationships with their parents, with their mothers specifically, but generally with their parents, because obviously Senjo Gahara's relationship with her mother is central to that plot, and then you have Mayoi Snail, which is about Araragi, kind of not wanting to go back home on Mother's Day, and about Mayoi dying as she was attempting to go to visit her mother, because her parents were divorced, going to visit her mother on Mother's Day. So it's all about that relationship with the parents. Then you have the Suruga arc, which again, the relationship with her mother. I don't recall to what extent it's really brought up in that arc, but obviously the monkey's paw was a gift from her mother. And then you have the Hanekawa arc, which, where she deals with her abusive parents. So yeah, it runs all throughout the story, and I do think on some level it's a representation of one of Nishio Ishin's deeper thematic concerns about modern youth's relationship with the adult world, and obviously one way of representing that is just the parent-child relationship, but maybe that's a topic for another day. But all of this just to say that, the whole psychoanalysis thing, the whole Jungian thing, tidying your room, maybe Nishio Ishin's been watching some Jordan Peterson. That's the joke, guys. No, but the connection between psychoanalysis and the messy room, Suruga's messy room, is noteworthy to me, because in my mind there's always been this potent sort of metaphorical association between the messy room and the unkempt, hairy devil's hand that she has concealed underneath those bandages. There's a connection there between the unkempt, messy hand and the messy room, the kind of messy subconscious that's right beneath the surface that she has to deal with. She obviously has a lot of psychological hang-ups that she needs to work through, and the messy room being an obvious metaphor for that. And in this story, Ogi explicitly kind of talks about Suruga's messy room as being, well, he talks about hoarding, that she's hoarding, and it having to do with how she lets all of these emotions build up within her, emotions that she doesn't really deal with until they finally explode. And obviously that's what happened in her first arc, where things turned violent, her feelings toward Araragi, her jealousy, her envy. And in this story it has to do with her relationship with her mother, as always, the deceased mother, who still has a strong presence and who will have actually a literal kind of physical presence at the end of the story, because she ends up making an appearance, not in her own form, but as a kind of spirit, and they have a conversation, her and Suruga. But here, this story is really about Suruga transcending that relationship with her mother, kind of cutting herself off from that past burden, those feelings of kind of chasing after her mother in some way. Because, first of all, the note that she's trying to decipher, it wasn't meant for her, right? It was written for her husband, for Suruga's mother's husband, Suruga's father. So it's really about Suruga learning to move on from her mother, to realize that she is not her mother, and that she doesn't need to continue her mother's task. She needs to find her own path in life, basically. And like I said, the story climaxes with this ghostly encounter with the mother's spirit, which comes to Suruga in the form of another ghost, Numachi Roka, who was the other girl in Hana Monogatari, and basically tells Suruga to not bother trying to decipher the note, and to not bother going after the devil parts, because it's not her problem, basically. And there's something very heartwarming about this story that's basically about an orphan, because Suruga is an orphan, learning about her parents and their relationship, their romance. And there's an interesting part of the story where the mother says this. I'll just read it, actually. She says, "I wanted to rid myself of the Gaien name, and that Oni-chan," referring to her husband, "wanted to rid himself of the Kanbaru name too. That's probably what brought us together. And he used these fusuma I gave him without revealing their origin, probably as a bit of vengeance against home." So we know that Suruga's paternal grandparents, with whom she's living, weren't a big fan of Gaien Toei, Suruga's mother, and they felt that she was kind of, stealing their son away from them, away from their family. But here, there's an interesting notion that they're both basically trying to flee their family names, that sort of burden, that tradition, and trying to create their own path in life. But obviously that connects to Suruga's own issues of needing to find her own path in life, and not just follow in her mother's footsteps or whatever. So it's a kind of sweet story about a daughter learning or getting to know her parents a bit through their intimacy, their romance, these little things that they shared with one another, and learning that she now has to make a name for herself, so to speak. She needs to find her own path in life, which makes sense, obviously, because this is an important transitional period in her life. This story is set at the end of her final year of high school. So Araragi has already been away for a year now, and so now she has to clean up her messy room by herself. Obviously Araragi was the one who helped her before, but now the kind of hero figure, the savior figure Araragi is gone, so she has to become a hero herself. And that's sort of the decision she makes at the end of the arc, that she's going to go find all these devil parts and destroy them, but she's not going to do it for Araragi or for her mother. She's just going to do it for herself. And actually the whole hero thing, the whole savior thing, is obviously another important running theme in the series, and we really see that. I mean, we see it from Araragi's perspective, but we see it also in the arcs where Araragi is absent from the story, and the other characters have to sort of fend for themselves and save themselves. Obviously the whole idea of the characters saving themselves is the running theme, but there's always been that fundamental contradiction in the series. Are they saving themselves, or is Araragi saving them, or is he enabling them or giving them the ability to save themselves? It's something he's had to contend with, his own position as the savior figure, the hero, and what that really means. And now these other characters have to learn how to not depend on him and become heroes in their own right, or save themselves truly, and clean up their own messy rooms. I mean, yeah, we already saw that in the previous story with Sadachi. And so yeah, all of that in this little story that's just set in one location with just about 2 characters and one object of interest. That's what Nishio Shin is able to wring out of such small, minimal circumstances. And this is why the Monogatari series can just go on forever, can't it? Because Nishio Shin's brilliant at developing these sort of nuanced, multi-layered thematic threads and narrative arcs that just keep kind of building and developing in different ways, and resonating and reflecting in different ways for each different character. It's like this big tree that just keeps growing. So you can have an exploration of that savior theme from Araragi's perspective, because he is the de facto savior, but then you can also have that reflected in all of the other characters. How do they deal with the fact that they're being saved or need to be saved, and maybe Araragi isn't there, so they have to save themselves. And there's also all of these little interesting little character quirks and characteristics that we associate with these individual characters, like, for example, Suruga's messy room. And these are just threads that Nishio-Ishin can choose to pull on at any moment in the story. So you can have an entire arc, an entire little story that's about Suruga just dealing with her messy room, with that one, fundamental characteristic that we've come to associate with her character, that's sort of, that's a sort of comedic characteristic. There's something comical about that, and yet it can also tell us a lot about her character. It would be like having an entire arc about Mayoi dealing with her backpack or something, and that being a metaphor for the burden that she has to deal with of being trapped in the body of a young girl who's supposed to be going to school and living a normal life, but she's actually a ghost and she'll never be normal, but she carries this bag around that's sort of a symbol of that normal life that she'll never be able to live. So there could be an arc where she's just going through the items in that bag, and she ends up deciding to throw the bag away or something. This is the way Nishio-Ishin seems to approach the story, right? There are big, kind of more dramatic arcs, but he can also write these smaller, character-focused arcs where it's just characters dealing with these little aspects of their character. And I think isn't that a fascinating way to go about telling a story? And that's what I mean when I say it can go on forever, because you can just keep building on these little characteristics as the characters go through their lives and grow up and age. It can really go on forever, and I think that might be Nishio-Ishin's intentions. I think when he finished Owari and decided to continue the story anyway, I think that was him saying, you know what, this is going to be my life's work. This is going to be the series that I'm just going to write for the rest of my life. And I'm all for it. I'm on board. So yeah, anyway, that's today's episode. Hopefully episode 3 will not be out next year. I think I might actually be able to get it out this month. But yeah, so the next episode will be dealing with the final arc in this first book, which I believe is entitled Tsukihi Undo, and it's told from Yotsugi's point of view. And I've actually already started reading it, and it's really, really funny. So I look forward to finishing that and talking about that next time. Yep. All right. Consider, commenting, liking, doing all the stuff, supporting me on Patreon if you want. I'll see you in the next one.